like to introduce Anne, and she's going to talk a little bit about the history of these paintings, how they came to be, and what the history of that period in Andalusia is. And then afterwards, she'll take some questions if you like. Anne.
Thank you, Deborah. So, first of all, of course, I have to thank you for coming, and thank the Jerusalem Fund Gallery of the Palestine Center and Dagmar Painter, its curator, for hosting and beautifully displaying my art, the exhibit Mihrab Portal. So tonight I'd like to select just a few items of interest about this fascinating period of 700 years in Andalusia, Spain, when Jews, Christians, and Muslims commingled and produced riches in architecture, art, literature, and science to rival the later Italian Renaissance. We really don't know enough about it. So first, just a little bit for those of you who've been to Andalusia, Spain, which is now a little strip in southern Spain. In this era, the geography of Andalusia, it was large enough that it spread almost to the Pyrenees. It pretty much took up all of Spain. And at the end, of course, there was a diaspora of Jews and Arabs in the last years when the Catholics consolidated power, and they then spread to North Africa, Portugal, and Palestine. So how did this happen? How did this remarkable thing happen? So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the Mihrab as portal and its significance, and then I want to mention two remarkable friendships that are examples of the cross-cultural communication between the cultures that marked the era. So how did it happen? It happened because of an incredibly remarkable young man, Abd al-Rahman, who in his teens lost his whole family. They were massacred by a rival Muslim faction, the Abbasids, in Damascus, Syria. And a few years later, he fled to Andalusia. He was welcomed almost as a prince because he had a lineage with his father's background, went to Muhammad, and his mother was related to the Berbers of North Africa. So he came with a good lineage. But he himself was absolutely remarkable in his wisdom. And it was because of his policies of inclusion and generosity in establishing the policies of his ummah when he became caliph, his community, that there was this flourishing period. His definition of the Islamic Ummah was very similar and harked back to Muhammad. It was an homage to also Muhammad. And he was remarkable in that he brought to Andalusia the traditions from Damascus, that many layered culture, where things were assimilated, not destroyed. They were combined and assimilated. And an example of that is when he built his, first he rented a space in the Catholic Cathedral for the worship. And then when his community got bigger, he built a mosque without destroying the existing church. So the beautiful mosque that he built is in the church, which has now become, was in the cathedral, which has now become a cathedral again, and the mosque is still intact. I think that's a wonderful example. About the Mihrab as portal. As an artist, some shapes draw me, and one is this horseshoe arch, sometimes called the keyhole arch, of Islamic architecture. And so I determined that these paintings would all include the Mihrab, not really quite knowing why I was so drawn to it. But as I studied more about the era, it became more and more resonant with multiple layers of meaning. So the Mihrab is a portal to paradise, and it's the place of an epiphany. So when a devotee enters the Alhambra, the devotee enters through archways into a garden that also symbolizes paradise, goes into the mosque under archways, takes a prayer rug that might have a mihrab woven into it with representations of a garden in the form of flowers or abstract figures, and place that prayer rug facing the mihrab that faces Mecca. So it has so many resonant metaphors for me. And also, I'd been doing quite a bit of reading, and Frithjof Schoen had a wonderful phrase where he said he felt that the Mihrab was equivalent to the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple. And then Muhammad received his revelations in a cave. So all of these cave-like forms became very resonant for me, and I decided that that's how I wanted to present the paintings of this era. So the two remarkable friendships were between Shmuel Hanagit, a Jew, and the Caliph of Cordoba. And then there was a later friendship between King Ferdinand III of Castile and Ibn Amar, who was the Caliph of Granada at a later time. And I want to talk about these two friendships because they are examples of the freedom of both Jews and Muslims and Christians to cross into one another's cultures and be at home and accepted and even revered and studied. So Shmuel Hanagit was educated in Cordoba, and if you were educated in Cordoba, it's kind of like you were at Harvard, Yale, MIT, and the Sorbonne all at once. It was a model of education. And he went to Granada, and while he was in Granada, someone from the Caliph's court gave him kind of a freelance job to write some of the diplomatic correspondence for the Caliph. And they were such fine documents that the Caliph wanted to know who was writing these wonderful, wonderful documents for him, and found out it was Shmuel Hanagit and hired him to be his vizier. So that's a very, very important post. And then later he became the leader of the Caliph's armed forces and went to battle. At the same time he was involved in the Islamic court, he was still the leader of his Jewish community in Granada. Nagid is an honorific for a leader of a Jewish community. So it was a wonderful road that he was able to traverse back and forth between the two cultures. There are two examples of his poetry out in the lobby that I have taken. They're morsels of his poetry. Hanagit is considered by many Jews to be the hero of the Golden Age of Jewish poetry. And he was able to write both in Arabic and in Hebrew. In his Arabic and Hebrew, he often modeled his verses after the Arabic courts that he frequented. And so there's a poem out there called Hanagit's Pearl that he wrote in honor of that. And then he had a whole series of poems that he wrote about his experiences in war. And there's another morsel of a poem that's an elegy for his brother who was killed in war. It's a very remarkable person whose poems were actually lost for 700 years and retrieved by Chaim Nachum Bialik, who was a publisher in Tel Aviv, found in, I think it was New York. An amazing story. The other friendship is between King Ferdinand III of Castile and Ibn Amar, who was the Nasrid Sultan of Granada, about 200 years later than this story with Shmuel Hanagit. And at that time, Ferdinand III was conquering different territories to add to his power. Ibn Amar was known as a pacifist caliph or sultan. And Amar learned that Ferdinand's troops were encamped outside of his city. and practiced diplomacy. So he sent a caravan of camels laden with gifts and negotiated with King Ferdinand. In exchange for assisting Ferdinand in his battles, he would be allowed to retain the caliphate of his territory. And they became friends. And not only did they become friends, they frequented each other's palaces, but Ferdinand III's son, Alfonso the Wise, also became Ibn Amar's friend. If that diplomacy had not happened, we would not have the really final glorious monument of Andalusia, the Alhambra, which was built by Ibn Amar's descendants. So just closing remarks before you bring me questions, and I hope you do. I'd like to contrast this era in Andalusia, the openness, the respect, and the inclusiveness that created riches and beauty and preserved learning. Actually, the Library of Paris was founded on the translated books from Greece and from Baghdad that were taken care of in Andalusia. I want to contrast that and what happened there to the Dark Ages in Europe, which occurred about the same time, where the purpose was to rout out heresy and differences, and which led to untold misery and destruction of culture. And I'd like to, the reason I wanted to bring this exhibit and all its beauty is to show us a model of a different way. And I hope that we all embrace that and think about that, and it becomes more prevalent than the earlier one in the Middle Ages.